Police work is tough work.
She was exhausted, she was outworked, but the one thing that kept her going was going home and seeing that little boy.
It's a daily struggle. Some days I just want to scream so loud.
I'm not going to let my sister be forgotten.
This conversation needs to continue to be out there, and it needs to be talked about all the time.
I'm Brad Edwards. Chicago has a problem. Well, more than one. Violent crimes spiking, nowhere feels safe, and the officers tasked with protecting the city have been pushed past their limits. 12-hour-plus days, no time off, no time for self-care, and literally killing themselves. 3 in the past month. One of those, CPD officer and loving mom, Patsy Swank. As CBS 2 investigator Megan Hickey reports, her family is now demanding change.
Officer Patsy Swank's brother blames the culture at CPD. He says the regular 12-hour shifts and canceled days off didn't give his sister the time she needed to get help.
She was exhausted, she was outworked, but the one thing that kept her going was going home and seeing that little boy.
Ryan Clancy tells me his sister wanted to be a police officer so badly that she kept her pregnancy a secret while she was going through the police academy.
Didn't tell anyone, didn't complain about it. She wanted it so bad. She wanted to serve others.
Ryan says now 5-year-old Scotty was her world. But in the days and weeks before she took her life on July 2nd, Officer Swank worked 22 days in a row. 12-hour shifts have become the norm.
I'm angry.
In his eulogy, Ryan criticized the Chicago Police Department for giving officers mental health resources, but no time to use them.
We are not even giving them time off to process what they see.
Little did he know that soon after his sister's funeral, a 42-year-old officer also took his own life, followed by a 47-year-old police sergeant who died on Sunday.
3 officers in 2 weeks now. I mean, the city is in a crisis.
Each of their losses is a tragedy.
While these cases can be complex and we don't always know the reasons, Superintendent Brown said he agrees that we're in a crisis, listing the many different types of faith-based counseling, peer support, and employee assistance programs available for officers and their families.
We need to do more as a culture and a department by making every individual responsible for well-being.
Dr. Robert Sobo, who directs CPD's Employee Assistance Program, said they currently have 11 licensed clinicians. Another one starts on Friday, 2 more start in August. But Patsy's family says it's not enough.
To our mayor, to our superintendent, you need to do something, because I'm not going to go away. I'm not going to let my sister be forgotten.
4 aldermen, with the support of Officer Swank's family, are holding a press conference on Wednesday to call for hearings to address mental health challenges for CPD officers. Spokesperson for Alderman Tabaris's office says we'll get more details coming up on Friday. At CPD headquarters, Megan Hickey, CBS 2 investigators.
Officer Swank, one of 3 in the past month. Sobering. Add to that, more than a dozen Chicago police officers have died by suicide in the last 4 years. It's a combination. Hours, no days off, no real mental health support. Compounding it, no death benefits for families. In a moment, we'll have a panel discussion. Right now, our Dana Kozlov with one CPD widow's push for change.
It's a daily struggle. Some days I just want to scream so loud.
It's been 16 months since Julie Trolia's husband, Chicago police officer Jeff Trolia, died by suicide.
And I've looked back through pictures, I have looked back through years of our life, and I honestly cannot see any warning signs of this ever happening.
Julie found him in their basement. He was alone in the house when he died, just days after talking to Julie about the recent suicide of another CPD officer.
And he was talking about how sad it was and what a sad place he had to have been in. And then 3 days later, we were in that same situation.
Besides her profound grief, questions, and even anger, she had to learn to care for their 3 young daughters without him. She had to figure out money and insurance, which she lost 90 days after he died. And because he took his own life, there were no CPD line of duty death benefits.
Even though he didn't die in the line of duty, he gave up his life every single day.
Chicago Alderman Matt O'Shea agrees, which is why he's pushing an ordinance that would extend those benefits to families like Julie's.
If somebody that we love dies of suicide, of hopelessness, which really is what it is, or of another chronic illness. We should be showing up for these people.
Alexa James heads Chicago's National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. She worked with CPD and officers for a year to help enhance mental health support programs.
The response that I got from police in focus grouping with them, and also just spending a lot of time with them, was, we welcome you, we need change, we are not okay.
James says there's been progress, but Julie wants more.
This conversation needs to continue to be out there, and it needs to be talked about all the time.
Heady stuff. Now we are joined by CBS 2 investigator Megan Hickey, joined on Skype by former CPD officer turned psychologist, Dr. Carrie Steiner. We'll talk with her in a moment, but let's begin with CBS 2 political investigator Dana Kozlov. Dana, your story in part on death benefits. City Council, they're actually talking about that in real time.
Yeah, you know, the death benefits to families of officers who have died by suicide, that specifically passed City Council a couple of weeks ago. There's finer points in that ordinance, though, that I think families are going to need to review, that I think families and also their lawyers are going to need to review, because I don't believe it's an automatic. So there's some hurdles to jump there. That's one issue. But then now there's a group of alder people who are elevating sort of the focus on this issue and came out with a package of several ordinances, 6, maybe 7, that address this idea of officer mental health and indirectly officer suicide in various proposals. One of them, my understanding, is 19th Ward Alderman Matt O'Shea is proposing an ordinance that would only allow the department to cancel, or let me rephrase that. I just learned about this. That would make it a requirement for officers to have at least one day off a week. That's actually something that they feel they need to propose right now. And another example, for instance, and I'm going to refer to my note of something that they're proposing before various committees, is limit the authority of the Chicago Police Department, the top brass, to cancel days off. But specifically what that language looks like is still being worked out, and when it's going to be discussed in committee, what committees all these various ordinances are going to, is also still being worked out.
Dr. Steiner, want to bring you now into our conversation. We so appreciate you joining us. Again, former CPD officer turned doctor, turned psychologist. I would imagine this was one of the very reasons you took that journey.
I did. Actually, the very first day that I hit the street in Chicago, my FTO told me that we were going to go to a wake, and I thought it was going to be one of his friends. And he said, oh, it was a wake of an officer that killed themselves in the district we worked. And he said, well, he had just had personal problems. And then that year, 2 other people in the district I worked in also committed suicide. And I was told again that they all had personal problems. And that's when I started to work on my doctorate. And when I was working on my doctorate and understanding more about trauma and the exposure to trauma, I found that actually being exposed to a lot of trauma impacts a human, and police officers are human. And so that increases their chance of developing a mental illness, including increased chance of suicide. And I started to just realize myself that I was changing, and the people that I had started from the academy were changing, or just the people that I was interacting with. A lot of people were on their second marriage. Maybe they were drinking a little bit more. They weren't handling things quite as well. They weren't going out and doing the normal activities that they would do, or hobbies. And I just started to see a lot of change happen. And when I worked for the Chicago Police Department, I had about 13 years on, and in that time I knew 17 officers that had committed suicide. And I don't believe that's all the officers that committed suicide. Those were the people that I directly knew. And so because of those reasons, and because I did become a psychologist, I was like, I can't sit here knowing that there's still officers needing help and I could help them, but I can't because I'm a Chicago police officer. So that's why I actually quit the job to become a psychologist, to help my fellow brothers and sisters.
Dr. Steiner, this is now being taken as really topic A, front and center, an issue that probably should have been talked about long ago and many times over, is now being talked about. We'll see what really happens. But in CBS 2 investigator Megan Hickey did a piece, and it's remarkable. We're talking about an officer that worked potentially 20 plus days in a row, 12 plus hours a day. I mean, I can't even imagine doing that in any line of work, let alone what an officer has to do, what they have to see, the political climate they're in. It would almost make someone delusional. It's almost a recipe for suicidal ideation, is it not?
Yes, anytime you have a lack of sleep and you have increased stress, the likelihood that you're going to develop a mental illness, or that if you are having any stressors or a mental illness, the likelihood that that's going to increase is substantial. And it's important for people to recognize that if somebody is awake for 17 hours, they're really functioning at a BAC level of 0.05. If they're awake for 24 hours, they're functioning at a BAC level of 0.10. So they're really under the influence. And actually, studies even show that somebody that's functioning at a 0.05 and is tired compared to somebody that's actually under the influence, the person that is actually tired does worse on performance tasks than the person that's actually drunk or under the influence. So these are substantial things, and I'm surprised that Chicago police officers are not getting into more car accidents, having accidents, again, developing more mental health symptoms, and also increasing the chance of suicide. And we've seen 3 in the last month where there is contagion for suicide.
Absolutely. Doctor, points all duly noted. Megan Hickey, that was your piece, and it was an excellent piece. It was poignant. It was something to think about. Officer Swank took her own life July 2nd, one of 3 officers this past month. What did her family say? What changes had they seen in what clearly was a cumulative and almost snowballing workload that immediately preceded her untimely death?
You know, it's interesting. I spoke with her brother. I also spoke with her mother off camera, who wasn't quite ready to go on camera. But she talked about how they really didn't notice any of those telltale red flags. It was really that she was stressed out about working. And actually, the day that she did it, like I said, 22 days in a row, just leading up to when she took her life. But that night, she was going into a 4 a.m. shift. And that was, weighing on her, that she had that morning shift that she was getting ready for. And she constantly talked about needing to, be with her son. She had a 5-year-old son, and not having the time to be with him. And so their biggest critique, aside from the canceled days off and just the stress and not sleeping and how that impacts you, is the fact that every moment that she had to herself, she didn't want to go talk to a therapist or go to the precinct and meet with a counselor. She wanted to spend it with her son. So their biggest critique is that she didn't have the time to access these types of employee services that CPD offers. And, Dr. Sobo got up on earlier this week, a few days ago, and said that, CPD has the most comprehensive services. We have, all these different people you can talk to and programs that you can go through if you're feeling this way. But again, the Clancys are saying she didn't have time to do that, or she didn't feel like she had time to do that. She wanted to give that time to her son.
Can I bring up an interesting point? Is that okay? You talked about how her mom and her brother said there really were no warning signs. And I realize, and this is certainly a question for the doctor, but Julie Trolia, who we saw in the piece I did a couple of weeks ago, she also mentioned that 3 days before her husband died by suicide, she'd never seen any warning signs. And 3 days prior, they talked about a fellow officer who also took his own life, and he had expressed how sad he was for him because he must have been in a horrible place, and he can't imagine being in that horrible place. And then 3 days later, she's telling me they found themselves in the same situation. So I wonder if there is suddenly a moment of stress where stress just overtakes these officers, or perhaps anyone who takes their own life. I mean, maybe that's something
Yeah, let's kick that to Dr. Steiner. Dr. Steiner, when you talk about, nobody probably has a better poker face than a cop, right? And nobody's got better poker faces than CPD officers. And also, nobody is really taught to better, I mean, let's be honest, cover up their emotions, go do the job. They are soldiers out there. Right now they are fighting a war on crime. So all this, when you add up the cumulative effect now is 3 completely unforeseen, as far as we know, suicides in just this month. How do you combat that?
Well, I think that although there may not be overt warning signs, somebody who's working substantially, not getting enough sleep, is stressed out because of the amount of trauma that they're seeing. I mean, this year, I think the last stat I know about how many people were killed was around 352 in Chicago. That's a lot of trauma for officers to see, and that's not normal. Most people don't see people murdered or stabbed or leaving babies and things like that. So just the cumulative trauma effects impact an officer. But because also officers do have to do a very good job of managing their emotions and not showing emotions, that makes it difficult for a lot of clinicians as well as family to see that that person is hurting. But one of the other things is that sometimes there are people that have been thinking about suicide for a long period of time, but there are a number of people that it is a very impulsive act, that they just are like, I just want to be out of the pain and I'm sick of it. And they decide right now that they want to kill themselves. And we see that more often with first responders, that it's more of a situational rather than a buildup of, I've been thinking about killing myself for 6 months. And that is not true for this population.
That's interesting, especially when you're talking about people who were no warning signs, but then working 20 plus days in a row, 12 plus hours a day, no time to spend with their family. Dr. Steiner, I'm going to have my cohort, CBS 2 political investigator Dana Kozlov has a question for you. Dana, go ahead.
So, Dr. Steiner, a couple weeks ago, I talked to the head of NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness, who had worked with the Chicago Police Department for about a year to try to expound upon programs for these officers. And she had expressed a couple things. Number one, that many officers in roundtables to her said, no, we want these services. And she believed that the department was making progress. But Julie Trolia, the officer's wife, had mentioned that more needs to be done. And specifically what these programs are, we don't really have a handle on what those programs are. So my question to you would be, what is the number one thing you think the police department needs to do here in Chicago for struggling officers that perhaps it's not doing right now?
I think the one thing that they're not doing now is integrating officer wellness in the day-to-day life of a police officer. So they have programs that an officer can reach out to and do on their own, but they're not integrating wellness into the day-to-day. So they really need to think about talking about things in roll call, maybe even doing a meditation or a grounding technique, deep breathing. I know that this can kind of sound out there, but statistics and studies show that that is significant for people. When people are having a crisis or are directly involved with a critical incident, like the officers who knew Officer Swank and the other officers who killed themselves, they should be getting an individual or a group debriefing where they should understand what are common reactions to this, how do you build resiliency skills, and what are risk factors so there isn't contagion. And that isn't something that officers have to go out and get. Remember, first responders are the people, they go to the calls that people are, committing suicide. So it's very, very difficult for an officer to reach out and to say, I need that help. I, being a former police officer myself, would not reach out. Also, what I see with Chicago police officers now, when I see them as a client, is when I ask them, how was your night? I had an officer the other day come in and said, oh, it was fine. And I said, really? Are you sure it was okay? And then he went on to tell me that a person was shot and so was the child, and that he had to hold the child and take care of it. And he didn't know if the mother was going to live or not. And he was is starting to get upset and started to cry and things like that. And he was like, I had no idea that affected me. So here, an officer who had a critical incident, he didn't even know that that was a critical incident. He didn't even understand that until he was actually asked and then talked about it. And this is what needs to happen, is that they really need to start talking about it rather than saying, oh, do you need help? Are you okay? Those are not right answers. It's about understanding and doing trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care is assuming that people have been impacted by trauma and that you give them care. And that's what needs to happen on the Chicago Police Department.
Duly noted, Dr. Steiner. And also one thing I think important you said is officers I talk to say it needs to happen at work during their shift. You can't ask someone to work 14 hours, 15 days in a row and say, hey, if you need help, call in your off time, because it's the last thing you're going to do on that finite time you have off. So that's a good point, that it needs to happen within the work shift, within workflow, care should happen within the workday. CBS 2 investigator Megan Hickey has a question for you, Doctor.
Yeah, and kind of going off of Dana's questions, I know the head of CPD's Employee Assistance Program has repeatedly touted CPD as having one of the most advanced, well-rounded employee assistance programs in the country, really patting his department on the back for the services that they provide. Which is hard for us to fact check, right? Because we can't reach out to every police department in the country and try to figure out, where does ours stack up? So I was interested in getting your thoughts on just how comprehensive our programs are. And also he brought up the fact that there are currently 11 licensed clinicians on the payroll. They're adding hopefully 3 more by the end of the summer. They have plans to add 3 more. Does that make a big difference? And is having more access, more one-on-one time with those types of licensed clinicians, does that make a difference?
I think it is hard to substantiate exactly how well a system is working or not working. However, what we do want to look at is how many suicides are happening, and too many are happening. So that means that there's something wrong with the system that's currently in place. And that is something that has to change. So no matter if you feel that we have got the greatest system in the world, if we still have a lot of officers committing suicide, then what we have is not working. And I believe that one of the things that I do think that Chicago does need to do is needs to offer other options other than just within the department. Some people feel very comfortable using department chaplains and the EAP, and some people do not. And then where do those people go? For most people that I talk to, they say, we don't know what other places we can go. And if we want to, then we have to look it up ourselves. I think they needed some vetted clinicians that they can also seek that are outside services. So if somebody does not want to use the services, then they still can get services. And I think that also, it is important to have clinicians, but it's also important to have clinicians that are doing evidence-based treatment and that they're trauma-informed care. It doesn't matter if you have 2,800 clinicians if you don't have quality clinicians that are understanding what PTSD is, depression, anxiety. Again, most EAPs, once they find somebody's having more of a struggle, they usually refer out, which in Chicago, they don't always do that. They usually still continue to see that person. But in Chicago, they also don't take notes. And I think that one of the problems with that is that as a clinician, I use my notes to really be able to guide a plan of action to try to get that person help. And if I have no notes at all on how I'm trying to help that person, I think it would be very hard to be able to do your job. And it's also very hard as an owner of my own practice. You cannot substantiate then how well your clinicians are doing and what they're doing in session. And so I am scared about that there's no note taking. I understand because as a Chicago police officer, I thought this is great, then nothing can harm me. But what I'm seeing is that officers are not maybe necessarily getting the best care because they're not doing what most clinicians do, and that is having a treatment plan, following up, and things like that. And if you have a clinician that understands police and public safety, they do understand how to write notes where they wouldn't be getting an officer into trouble by documenting the session.
It's a really important point. And again, this is not a bash CPD or brass policy. This is our officers need help. And how do we get them that help? That said, CPD says we've got programs. We've got the best of the best. Is there any way to objectively prove that? Is there any gold standard out there, Doctor, that you know of? That CPD should look at as a template?
Well, I think that the International Chiefs of Police have a policy, and the National Consortium on Preventing Law Enforcement Suicide have suggestions on how to do that. And I think that although CPD has some of them down, some of them they don't. And that's best evidence-based treatment for dealing with a suicide, dealing with the aftermath of the suicide. I think that although there are resources, we also are not doing good post-vention, which means after a suicide, we still have work to do. And that's not a time to just say, oh, that's so sad, I'm sorry that happened, and go get help if you need. But it is really to be able to say, okay, how do we support the people that were directly involved and the family that was directly involved, and how can we support that? Understanding also why did this happen so we can have more insight into preventing that as well. But also understanding that there is a contagion. So we want to get out best resiliency strategies, coping strategies. Again, when you're at work, not having to reach out to go, after working a 12-hour day and an hour drive to and from work, and then an hour other drive to a clinician's office, and then an hour at the clinician, right? You're going to hit that 17, 18-hour mark already. So it has to be something that's incorporated in the day-to-day. And what we also want to have is more handouts that are readily accessible so people can see that and also see that there's a variety of ways that they can get help. I love that the Chicago Police Department has a peer support. I think it's great that they have chaplain services and that they have EAP. However, that is not going to be enough. You have to do prevention and you have to do post-vention care. And that is something that I don't see as much as probably is needed for the Chicago Police Department.
The final word to you. Dr. Steiner, a one-time CPD officer turned psychologist and an expert in this field. Doctor, we appreciate your work. Thank you for joining us. Dana Kozlov, Megan Hickey, CBS 2 Investigators. We appreciate your work on this. And thank you for joining us for this special report. I'm Brad Edwards. Now back to the stream.